Eric Lopez here alongside Brian Murphy. The American Conference men's and women's basketball schedule is out. Nothing says, happy hour than college basketball scheduling coming out, Murph.
Yeah, not a moment too soon, Eric. We're only 5 days away from the first women's game.
That's it. Let's kind of recap here what we have with the schedule. The men's and the women's schedule came out on Friday. The men, okay, there they are. We'll get to them in a second here. I'm going to try to get the screen up for that schedule. They are going to open up against Oklahoma. We know that. We already know that part of the schedule. They're going to open with the Sooners Saturday, November 28th. Then UCF will host Auburn Monday night, November 30th. Then they go to Michigan, December 6th. Their conference opener, oh, by the way, Murph, in Houston against the defending conference favorites, Houston, December 15th. Then they got to go to Florida State, December 19th. The big headline here is UCF could be facing 3 top 25 teams in a row on the road here.
Yeah, at least they have 2 weeks. At least they have some space, though. The games are kind of spaced out a little bit. You know, you got 2 weeks with 3 games, but track.
Yeah, and so, by the way, they host Cincinnati. They host Cincinnati here, Brian. So I could make this argument right here. If I just stop the schedule right here, Oklahoma, Auburn, Michigan, Houston, Florida State, Cincinnati. I don't think there's ever been a 6-game stretch harder in the history of this program than that 6 games. What a way to start a season there. Granted, obviously everything is subject to change with what we're dealing with in the pandemic in 2020, Murph, but this team is going to learn a lot about each other early. I remember last year you talked about that opener and the conference slate early was rough for that team as they were trying to figure themselves out. They're going to try to figure themselves out in those first 6 games.
Yeah, and it's amazing when you look at that schedule, who's the weakest team there? Like, it might be Cincinnati, which is kind of nuts, but it might be. And that's how difficult it be a grueling stretch.
It's really a wild schedule there. What else jumps out to you now that you've had a chance to digest the men's schedule first? We'll talk about the men's. We'll talk about the women later. But what jumps out to you about the men's schedule now that it's fully out?
Yeah, I'm still kind of working my way through it. It's only been out now for about a half hour. I think there are obviously notable home dates here that people want to know about, teams people like to come out and see, get tickets for. So the Cincinnati game is certainly one of them on the December 22nd. You have Memphis coming to Orlando on January 5th. Houston, the return trip to Orlando is on January 17th. That's a Sunday. And then you have the USF game, which is the second to last home game of the year for UCF. That's on Wednesday, February 17th. So just some notable games there. When I look at the way it's set up for UCF, though, we talk about how it starts, and then you can go past Cincinnati. Like, you've got Memphis and Tulane and Houston, SMU. You've got some really tough games in that early stretch. And so I think if UCF can like just kind of like tread water for the first half of the season, it kind of lessens up after the second half of the year, because you basically get rid of both Memphis games, you get rid of both Houston games, and now you're left with the Temples, the ECUs. What is Wichita State going to look like? We have no idea right now. So that's kind of like the most of their back half of the schedule. So the first half is an absolute bear. The second half could be easy, as it were. But they really need to survive those first like 15 games. It just look maniacal.
Well, and it's going to add pressure and questions about certain eligibility, right? Like if C.J. Walker gets cleared, when does he get cleared? These are important questions here early in the season with the way the schedule is, because my worry here, Murph, and we'll get more into detail about this as we're going to be talking a big basketball preview show at the podcast next week, so make sure you all tune in for that. Getting off to a slow start here, you don't want to dig yourself a hole. I felt like last year that team dug themselves a bit of a hole. It's hard to get out of it in this league in particular.
Sure, absolutely. And the problem is when you look at the schedule, you can kind of see that possibly happening, right? if this team doesn't gel quickly, team really firing early, they could start this season, possibly 2-5. I mean, or something around there. And then now you're trying to dig yourself out all the way through. Geez, I'm mesmerized by the first month of the schedule. It is treacherous. It is. I mean, look at that. I mean, Jaron Cumberland isn't with Cincinnati long gone. So without him, Cincinnati is probably the quote unquote the most winnable game there, I think. And yet, Cincinnati is just nails. They're so physical. They're always so physical. That's never an easy game. It is a dirty, muck it up kind of game. And so that's going to be really difficult. And then you're facing, before that, those 3 top 25 teams you talked about, Oklahoma and Auburn are, Oklahoma certainly is on the edge of the top 25 in some polls. Or 6-game stretch, excuse me. And they went 3-3. What would you say?
Take it.
Yeah.
I mean, because you're getting quality wins there. That's going to be, I will say this, the positive of that is the net, right? You go 2-4, 3-3 in that 6-game stretch. That's going to look good on the net, on the resume. And that is going to be so pivotal this year with so few of non-conference games across the country, and you don't know how many games you're going to get in. I don't know if when they decide to pick the field of 68, if win-losses necessarily, you don't have to have a glamorous win-loss record this year to get into the field of 68. You just got to prove that you could play people and beat some people. So the positive is you've got opportunities right off the bat here with the teams there. But again, it's about building that momentum. But so, yeah, I think 2-4, 3-3 would be gravy. I would take that in a heartbeat because that means you've beaten – you can make an argument, Murph, all 6 of those teams. And I know Auburn has a lot of youth coming back. They have so many experience. But Bruce Pearl, he's got recruiting. He knows how to recruit. All those 6 teams are NCAA tournament contenders. Like, they're going to either be in the tournament or on the bubble, I think.
Possibly. Absolutely possible. I mean, I think we would all be shocked if Michigan, Houston, and Florida State aren't in. Oklahoma should be in. Auburn, yes, they're extremely young. They don't return a lot of players from last year's team, but they do have some blue chip prospects. And then Cincinnati, again, not a star-laden team this year, not their best team for the last handful of years, but they are going to make it, a 55-54 kind of game, and it's going to be ugly. It's just going to be ugly.
Wow, it's tremendous there. You mentioned Wichita State. That's kind of an unknown, right? I mean, and we'll get into, we've talked about Greg Marshall and that scandal. He's out at Wichita State. They're going to have a lot of new faces. We don't know. They're probably going to have an interim coach this year. That could help UCF a little bit from that standpoint because it seems like Wichita State, this is kind of a lost year. Maybe they rally around certain things, but I don't know. SMU, a lot of people like, too. They got a lot of people back, and a lot of people are very high. In fact, they were picked, I believe, 3rd in the preseason poll in the league.
Yeah, and so Wichita State has they've got an interim coach in Isaac Brown, just a guy who's in house. He resigned without him, and all the defections that happened right after this thing. You look at the defections in March and April. That is a depleted team. So we just don't know what they're going to be like. That's usually a really hard trip. But this is probably the most vulnerable that Wichita State has been in a decade. And then, SMU is going to score. So that is not – again, and I think SMU is one of the games there in the early portion of the year that UCF has to deal with. Let me see. Actually, no, they get SMU they go to SMU near the tail end of the year, and they host them in the middle of the year. So that's a tough game in the middle of the year. Actually, they have Houston and SMU back-to-back at home in January. Sunday, January 17th against Houston. Saturday, January 23rd against SMU, back-to-back at home. That is difficult. But again, if you can get into February, so let me give you the February on schedule here. You have at Memphis, which is going to be tough. We get it. I mean, it's a house of horrors. It's the place where UCF can't win. But then home against Tulsa, Wichita State, at Cincinnati, home against South Florida, at Tulane, at SMU, home against Temple, at ECU. So you've got 8 or 9 games there where I think UCF can look at that and go, feasibly, they can go 6-3. If they play up to the talent this team has, I think this team is talented. They can go 6-3 there with losses against Memphis and Cincinnati. But some winnable games there. The issue is can they get enough in the first 15, 17 games to make up some ground late in the season?
Well, and we haven't brought up, after that Cincinnati game, they're at home against Tulane, December 30th. We know they're improved. They're a scrappy team. January 2nd, you go to Tampa to play USF. They should be healthier with Coach Gregory this year, and then host Memphis. So it ain't like you're not getting much of a breather after that first 6-game slate there. It's incredible. It is an incredible schedule. We'll get into more of that as we talk more about the basketball season on the podcast, Black and Go Banneret, later next upcoming week. Now, the women's schedule came out as well, Murph. And what's notably about this, by the way, first of all, there's a lot of dates, men's and women's double headers. You're going to be seeing them at home and away. If you're an old A-Sun fan, you might remember days where the men's and the women would play on the same gym and the same day. Well, they're doing that a lot this year, looks like, in the American, with the men and the women. For example, February 14th, UCF men and women's team will be at Cincinnati as well. Other dates of note, February 27th, December 30th, the men host Tulane, the women host Memphis. So interesting double headers, Murph. So men's and women's will be on the same day. It's kind of hard to describe that in the circumstances that we're in. In a normal year, we'd be saying, well, that could help the attendance for both type of thing, time slots. But I think with this one, it's an interesting strategy to schedule more of these doubleheaders, maybe make it easier flights for everybody. I'm not sure.
Yeah, they're all sort of playing it by ear. I understand the grouping of the games. You want to get in as quickly as possible with trying to mitigate travel and all that stuff. But I think the thing we haven't said yet that we should all say is this is all very tentative, right? Like, we know that this season is going to be hectic, much like the college football season has been. I know UCF hasn't had a game yet. UCF hasn't had a conference game postponed or canceled yet. But anybody who isn't living under a rock knows that it's been very difficult for college football, conferences to make it through a week unscathed. I think you're going to see that, if not more of that, in college basketball. So just let's all just take every game not for granted, like we do with football. Take every game not for granted. Cherish every game because you don't know how many you're going to get.
All right, let's look at the women's schedule here as I posted it up here. They open Wednesday against Virginia on November 25th. Then they go to LSU. The LSU is an NCAA tournament team. They're really good out of the SEC. And then they host Florida Gulf Coast, Murph, who you talk about three-point shooting. If you see the Houston Rockets in the NBA chuck up 50, 63s, that's Florida Gulf Coast. And they've done that very well for a long time. They've dominated the A-Sun. They're a contender. Then women's conference begins against Tulane on the 15th. Here's a rough part. December 19th, they will be at Tulsa on Saturday, December 19th. Then have to play at Georgia Tech in Atlanta Monday, December 21st. Talk about a quick turnaround there.
Yeah, that's weird.
Not a favorable schedule there. Then you see the rest of the schedule. December 30th, they host Memphis. That's that doubleheader where the men are hosting Tulane that day or that night. Who knows? It's going to be a day-night doubleheader. Who knows how they're going to schedule it. But here's some notables. Sunday, January 17th, they host Cincinnati. Cincinnati's picked third in the league. They have the preseason player of the year in Ilmar Thomas. Many believe. By the way, no UConn on the slate. Notice that? That's nice. No.
Yes.
I want to remind people about that. And then you're wondering, February 7th, right there. You see that? Super Bowl Sunday. UCF and South Florida, the two favorites, the rivals. I think I'm telling you, the league is going to embrace this rivalry now. With UConn gone in the women's league, UCF, USF, to me, are going to benefit from a TV exposure. I expect that to be an ESPN2 type of game, that counter-programming leading up to the Super Bowl pregame, I think you're going to see a TV slot. I think that Cincinnati home game could be an ESPN nationally televised game. You look at Sunday, Valentine's Day, February 14th. I mentioned the men are at Cincinnati, the women are at Cincinnati. That could be an ESPN nationally televised game. And then as I scroll down here, at South Florida to finish the regular season Tuesday, March 2nd. That could be for the conference championship. And if you remember that's probably could be a nationally televised game too. Because remember, South Florida would always finish the year against UConn. It'd be televised in ESPN, and it didn't mean anything. UConn just blew them out, but it was the marquee teams, quote unquote. I think you're seeing that with UCF and USF. I think you're going to see women's basketball is going to benefit from an exposure standpoint being on national television a lot this year, in my opinion.
I was interested in your opinion on that date for the USF game because it's not just a rivalry game this year. Like, as you said, those are the two best teams in this conference. And so to have that game in your building, but it's Super Bowl Sunday, it sounds like you think that's actually a good thing. That's actually going to help that game. Because I look at it and I'm like, why Super Bowl Sunday? Obviously no one paid attention to it, but you think it's actually not that bad.
It's a slot that they like to put women's basketball in. It's probably, if I had to bet right now, the game will probably be a noon tip, 1 o'clock tip, right? Because the Super Bowl will not kick off till about 6:20. So all the other networks, they want to get in their programming before the Super Bowl starts. The last thing you want to do is go up against the Super Bowl itself, because then nobody cares. But a lot of times, and I think the dates I mentioned, women's basketball, ESPN likes to use them as the counter programming to the NFL, especially the playoffs. We've seen that a lot. So I don't know if it necessarily benefits them from an attendance standpoint, although I think, USF, if it's an early enough tip, you could go to the game and then go back and watch the Super Bowl. So
but in terms of viewership, you like it.
Yeah, because you're going to be on nationally primetime. Otherwise, because here's the thing, if let's say that game was on a Saturday, it's a harder slot to find because there's so much men's basketball going on, and same thing during the week. So what women's basketball has kind of quietly done with their the TV partners in ESPN is they have selected certain nights where they dominate they put them a lot of games on. Like, for example, Monday night, they usually have games on ESPN2. Thursday night, they've tried to make that a big night for women's basketball. And Sunday has been a big day for them for women's basketball. So I think from a television standpoint, now, are they going to draw UConn numbers? No, they're not. Let's just get that out of the way. But I think it's important for these two teams to get that exposure and build that rivalry. I'll say this, Murph. Out of all the UCF-USF sports rivalries right now in the present, I think the women's basketball actually is the best rivalry of the group. You have you got two dynamic head coaches, and Jose Fernandez, great personality, loves to push the ball up, 3-point shooting, and Abe, we've dealt with Abe, great personality, defense. It's a counter matchup. And I think they're going to be competing for conference championships. You'll get the other sports. UCF's dominated in football. Men's basketball, neither program has been really good at the same time. I could argue the same thing for baseball outside of 2017. Softball, obviously, has had a long-time rivalry, and I think that'll continue. But and then women's soccer as well. But I think women's basketball with the two head coaches, I think they are going to be the top two teams in the league. I know a lot of people like Cincinnati, but they got a lot of players they got to replace. I think the league is going to build on UCF, South Florida, and Cincinnati to be their TV teams in the American.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You're right. I don't think people think about it enough because it's women's basketball. But you're right. This is the best rivalry. You've got two tournament quality teams who have been tournament quality for a handful of years now, going at each other. And again, this year they are the two best teams in this conference. So when I look at the schedule, that week in December at the very top, the Tulane, Tulsa, Georgia Tech week is just so weird because that Tulane game to start the conference season is not an easy game. And then you go on the road, and Eric, I don't know what happened there with those back-to-back road games 48 hours apart. Like, that is just so weird. That is going to be a really, really difficult turnaround. So that stands out. And then really the nuts and bolts of this schedule are the middle part of the year centered around that first USF meeting. But it basically is going to go away Wichita State on January 30th, Back State in Memphis, and then home South Florida, home Wichita State, away Cincinnati, away Tulane. That's a pretty treacherous run there. That 6-game stretch there is going to tell you a lot in January and February about this team. Then obviously we'll see how the season ends, but the way that season ends with USF in Tampa, that seems perfect, right? That should be, you would hope. Obviously, fans want UCF to go comfortably, but it would be kind of sweet if that was for all the marbles.
If you're the league, you're hoping that game is for the conference championship, and that you get a good TV slot because of that. Time will tell, obviously. And as you mentioned earlier, all of this is subject to change, unfortunately. But we hope. You're right. That stretch you mentioned is going to be tough. Obviously, as we'll get into more in the podcast, no KK Wright. Who's going to be that player for UCF on the women's side that takes over games like she did? She dominated South Florida throughout her career. That's going to be the big question there, is who steps up into that role. Coach Abe has talked about the scoring. It's going to come from the low post more this year. Diamond Battles will be handling the backcourt, but who's going to be that player for UCF that takes over games? I think it's going to be a balanced scoring, which I think is good, but you still need that player in those big moments against South Florida and Cincinnati. Who's going to take over those games? I think will be the biggest question for the women's side and could decide their fate this year as far as whether they win the league or not. Now, lastly, before we go, the men's and the women's will both be in the same place for the conference tournament in Texas. I know you're hoping to be out there. So the league clearly embracing the men and the women more and more here with regular season doubleheaders and then the conference tournament, which in a year like this, to play that tournament, hopefully, knock on wood, will be a lot at stake because your last chance to impress the committee. That I think eye test will be so important this year because of the limited amount of games. You don't have the amount of non-conference games you used to in the past, and you're basically judged on conference only. So eye test, I think the committee is going to go based on this eye test to pick their field of 68 in the men and 64 in the women.
And at least both of these programs have done their part in making sure that if it is all based on eye test, and it probably is cross-conference, they have pretty good non-conference slates. Each of them have put together good non-conference slates to test themselves, to show that, we were successful in conference, but we were also successful against, your quote-unquote power conference teams outside of conference as well. Everything is critical. Every game is critical. We get it. But the first month with UCF men's basketball, their quartet of non-conference games, and then Virginia and LSU for the women, it's going to be a big-time deal.
Well, hopefully we get to see them on the court. It goes as smooth as possible, right? As smooth as possible. Will there be hiccups? Probably so, but it's going to be exciting. By the way, you noticed as we highlighted some of the schedule, ESPN Plus. So you might want to have that if you want to watch the basketball. Then I noticed that Michigan game, Murph, for the men's Big Ten Network as well.
That is information. With UCF releasing its full schedule, the broadcast network for that game. So 4 p.m. on Saturday on the Big Ten Network at Michigan, December 6th.
Wow. That is a Sunday. That's a Sunday, 4 o'clock. Yeah. We're going up against the NFL, baby. Your brain's going to explode, Murph. You're going to be following UCF basketball and the NFL at the same time. We're all going to have our heads explode.
That's a lot. That'd be too much.
I won't let you think about it. All right. That's Brian that is Brian Murphy, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Eric Lopez. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube page. We're going to be doing more videos like this, especially for football and basketball. As all season long, we'll have a podcast, obviously weekly at Black and Go Banneret. Check us out at blackandgobanneret.com. Murph's got an article recapping the schedule that we just did. And so and we'll be doing some of these as well during the basketball season, covering it. Murph's going to be all over the place. Who knows where he's going to be? But, it'll be fun. Hopefully dry. Connection's good. Internet connection hopefully will be good. It'll be good drama this year, Murph.
I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be fun.
For Brian Murphy, I'm Eric Lopez. This has been the Black and Go Banneret.